Both Jacob and Greg said, we appreciate your generosity on several fronts. The help for the church at Lewis Street, and I think right at 50 bikes that were sent out to Fort Defiance, Arizona, along with some other work to be done out there. We appreciate those efforts, and we appreciate your generosity. For those of you who signed up to help with the trunk or treat next Saturday, look for an email just over the next day or so with a few particulars there. We appreciate several signing up. We could still use a trunk or two if you haven't signed up and that's what you want to do. We're actually more right now in need of someone to host a game or two. Appreciate that effort, and like I said, you'll be hearing more about that in the next day or so. If you're bringing your children out, please do sign up. You can use the QR code there and sign up for a time slot. Right now, everybody who signed up last week, it was very balanced across the time slots, so that worked pretty well last week. Hopefully that'll work well again today. But do sign up, and then you'll be notified toward the end of the week as a reminder of when your time to come is. You may still be open there in your Bible to Mark chapter 7. If not, go there. Mark chapter 7. And we're going to jump back to verse 14. Jesus makes just a very straightforward and bold statement that probably doesn't hit us to the degree, I know it doesn't hit us to the degree that it hit them when he said it. Verse 14, Mark chapter 7. And he called the people to him again and said, "Hear me, all of you, and understand." Now that ought to be a good hint that what he's saying is fairly substantial. You know, when you really say, "Now I want you to listen to me," what you're saying is, what I'm going to say is pretty important, it's pretty heavy, so I want you to make sure you hear what I say, and that's exactly what he has done. Then verse 15, he makes a statement. "There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him." Now, we look at that and we say, yes, that sounds familiar to us according to Scripture. If this was the first time we had heard that and we heard it out of the mouth of Jesus in that day and time, it would have hit us as absolutely scandalous. Now, stop and think here. He's saying there's nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of the person, those are the things that defile him. Now, I'll remind you, just back up a few verses, in the beginning of chapter 7. In the beginning of chapter 7, the Pharisees, along with some of their scribes, had come to Jerusalem. They see the disciples eat with hands that hadn't been washed. We don't want to eat with unwashed hands. We're obviously reminded quite often these days, wash your hands. Little kids, we tell them before they eat, wash your hands. And I don't know about around your place, but around our place with little kids around, when they're there, it's always, do I have to wash my hands or can I Germ-X? Because they've learned that Germ-X is a little bit quicker. So we understand that concept. Now, to them, it was more of a ceremonial thing. It was the ceremonial cleansing of yourself so that you could eat, and plus just the sanitary issue of washing the hands. But as Jesus then speaks here beginning in verse 14, then he is arguing against that, and he is basically saying, folks, those things don't really matter. Now, read again with me the text that Greg read just a moment ago, verse 17. "And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, about what he had said. And he says to them," here's his explanation. He says, when they ask, of course, his response to them is, "Then are you also without understanding?" In other words, did you not catch this? Did you not understand them? And we probably can assume that the disciples understood it. They think they know what he said. They want to make sure that they know exactly what he said. And then he goes on, verse 18, do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters, and notice this, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled. Now notice the parenthetical at the end of verse 19. Thus he declared all foods clean. Now, we look at that and we say, okay, there's a little bit of an explanation for us. They read that, they heard that, and even the people that are reading Mark's account, he makes clear the import of what Jesus has said. He says that by saying this, Jesus had declared all foods clean. And that is quite a big statement. That is a real big statement. Now, if you ask yourself the question, well, then did all Jesus' disciples understand from that point on that he had said that all things are clean? Well, the answer to that is no. Now, you might excuse Paul because, by the way, Paul wasn't here yet, but yet Paul was very well trained, so Paul would have been very concerned about those things. But then you might argue that, well, now Peter, he's here, but let me remind you that when you get into the book of Acts, and Peter's going to be brought to the Gentiles, and God appears to him in a vision, and there comes down a sheet, and all manner of creatures are on that sheet, and he says, rise, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter says, I don't do that. Only that which is clean touches my lips, and do I eat. And so in reality, even Peter hadn't understood this in its full context, at least not to apply it. But Jesus' statement is very big here when Mark declares, thus he declared all foods clean. Then he goes on. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. And then his explanation. He gives a little bit of a list here, and he explains himself exactly what he's saying. Verse 21. For from within, out of the heart, same thing, from within, out of the heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. This lesson this morning is intended really to be part 2 of last week's lesson. We talked about the dichotomy of doing, how that we do things for at least 2, and you can half it in a couple of different ways, for multiple reasons. We praise Abraham because he did because of what mercy God had laid upon him. And he moved based on his faith simply because God told him to do. But then James brings up, as we've talked about in reference to Romans, that we do a lot of things. We do good things, and we do good things for a reason. Here he's talking about, and as you can obviously see, the point is that it's the heart that it all comes down to. The only thing that can defile is the heart, that which comes out of the heart. Now, that which comes out of the heart is not simply words, because actions come out of the heart, right? So he's not saying that it's only the things you think. You know, there have been religious groups of people who over the years have thought that that's the way to see what's good and bad. You know, it's only the thought process that can be bad. The body itself and what the body does, the things we say and the things we do, they don't have anything to do with the spiritual. Well, obviously that's wrong. And we understand that to be wrong. Here in this text, you have Jesus saying that from within, out of the heart, come evil thoughts. But then he goes on, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit. These things are about things that we do. These are actions that we take. But they come from the heart. And what he's saying is, the evil in the world, folks, is not that which we might put into our bodies. It's that which comes out of our heart. And so we've got to guard our heart. Jesus would say on another occasion, it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. Think with me about a progression. If you will, from a right heart to a wrong motive. Just as an illustration of what we're trying to say today. You know, one heart serves out of gratitude. Abraham was made a great promise by God. And he strove to serve God because of the mercy and the grace that was extended to him and the wonderful promise that God had given him. We know that we need to do what we do out of a heart of gratitude. And we know that a heart that's not grateful doesn't do. That actions come out of a grateful heart. That good actions come out of a grateful heart. How many of us were raised going to church from the time we were very young? Let me show of hands. How many of you were raised going to church from a very young age? Most of us were. We understand that by that we have great advantage and we have some disadvantage. And if we don't see both of those, then I think we miss something. The great advantage is we know the Bible much better. We've been trained from the time we were in diapers how to speak and how to act. And so it's easier to do those things and to do those things consistently because we've been trained from our youth up in that sense, as Paul would say to Timothy. The difficulty of that is that the person who is living a life of sin, a person who is not dedicated to their God, but who is convicted of that sin, has an understanding of what they have been forgiven. And they are driven out of gratitude more so than those of us who've oftentimes been raised going to church all of our life. A first-generation Christian in that sense has an easier time being motivated out of a heart of gratitude. It's a little more difficult for, if you will, the second-generation Christian. Another witness is this great example of service out of a pure heart, service out of a heart of gratitude, a heart that is grateful to their God. And they see that as a great example. They're being mentored by that. How many of us have been led to serve others, serve the church, lead in areas of ministry and service because of the great example we've seen other people give us? And we wanted to emulate their example. And the reality is that is a wonderful thing, to emulate good and great service. But the difference is that person is not motivated in the same way. Because their motivation is not from within themselves, their motivation is from someone else and the example that they've seen, which is a great example and worthy of emulation, but still it's a little bit different. And yet another sees this example and serves because of the praise and the honor given to those who serve. We give praise and honor to people who serve and who serve well. And that's good and that's commendable. And another person sees that praise and that honor, and what they realize is that in a church environment, the way to be praised and the way to be honored is to serve. And so we take on service because we like the praise of men. Jesus talked about those, did he not? Who did things to be seen of men. As he was teaching about prayer, and he talks about people who did that, he says they have their reward. Many people, unfortunately, do things for the reward of praise. And Jesus said that's the only reward they're going to get because it's not the right motivation. it's not the right heart. You see, the truth is that each example comes from a different heart. You see, the first example, the person, their heart is a heart of gratitude and a heart of thankfulness. And it's serving and it's doing based out of that heart of gratitude. The second is serving, but they're serving to emulate good people doing good things. And that's worthy, but it still comes from a different heart. And if you're not careful, we can go from the right heart to an absolute wrong motive. People who are serving because they want the recognition for having served. And the reality is, folks, we're giving into that every time we make a statement that suggests that we're not appreciated for what we do. And the reality is, sometimes we've done it for so long that we even excuse it ahead of time. Now, I don't do things just to be praised, but hey, folks should have noticed. Well, if I don't do things in order to be praised, but the first thing I say is that folks should have noticed, what I need to do is be honest with myself and say that I do things partly out of praise or wanting or desiring the praise of men. You see, you know your heart is right in service when whether it's recognized or not doesn't matter. I kind of said this off the cuff in first service, but to be fair, then I feel like I need to say it again, so I will. I noticed about a year and a half ago, a change in a few people. In some areas of ministry. We had been constantly adding areas of ministry for about 3 years. And then kind of plateaued. We kind of saw a spot. Maybe some of you recognize this as I did. I think it was true. And there came a time at which folks that had been involved in service ministries started backing off just a little bit. And I even heard a couple of comments that were from the direction of, well, there's so many folks out there who ought to be doing things. I've been doing this a long time, and so I'm slowing down a little bit. And I don't have any problem with people saying, I've been serving here a long time, I'm going to serve over here. That's fine and good. That's all good. That's all good. But I heard a couple of comments that was suggesting that, well, there's a lot of folks that ought to be doing this, and there's folks that should be, but they're not, and so end result is, I think I'm not going to do it anymore. And what we reveal in that is a change in our heart. A heart that used to say, I do what I do to serve, and a heart that now tends to be saying that I'm going to stop serving because I wasn't appreciated. And it happens to all of us. It does. Just the ups and downs of our spiritual life. Trey did a great job Wednesday night talking about the slump. I told him just a minute ago, I actually meant to, I told him, I meant to text him Wednesday night to tell him how great a job he had done, but I was in a little bit of a slump, and so I didn't. But I did tell him today. We get in slumps. We ebb and flow. Our excitement ebbs and flows. It does. It's a reality. It's the truth. And it's understandable. And our God understands it as well. But I need to watch my heart to make sure that my motive is not changing. And that I am doing things out of a pure heart, if you will. You see, the reality is that being on God's side is a matter of the heart. Close with me in Romans chapter 2. In Romans chapter 2, we've been talking a lot about Romans, of course. Let me encourage you to be back tonight at 5 o'clock for Spencer Furby's presentation on Romans chapter 7. We all love Spencer. He's a great guy. I think you'll enjoy what he has to say tonight. So come back at 5 and hear that presentation. Jake, a few weeks ago, talked about chapter 2, and he talked about this text a little bit as he drew his lesson to a close. I want to go back to it for just a moment. The Jew of Jesus' day thought that they were special because they were born a Jew. They were circumcised. They had the covenant sign of circumcision. And it was a sign of the covenant. And so it was significant. It came to represent the idea that I am born a Jew. And so oftentimes, and specifically in Romans chapter 2, instead of saying because you're born a Jew, he says because of circumcision. And so that stands in place of that's the sign that I am a Jew. And as we've talked about so far a couple of times as we've studied Romans, they thought they were right in God's sight because of who they were. You know, they thought they were right in God's sight because of being born a Jew. And what Paul is telling them is you're right in God's sight when your heart stays right. And when you got a heart problem, you got a big problem. Verse 28, he sort of talks here about the true Jew, right? Because you see, the true Jew wasn't really a physical Jew. The true Jew was the one whose heart was set on serving God. Verse 28, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. You see, being pleasing to God and being a true child of God always has been and always will be a matter of the heart. As Jesus says, it's not about what you eat, folks. It's not about what goes into your body. It's about what comes out of your heart. That's why oftentimes forgiveness is such a challenge for us. That's why forgiveness is such a challenge for us. You see, we oftentimes want to see changed actions for a long time before we will decide whether or not we're going to forgive. God forgives immediately. Now you might argue, well, yes, but God knows the heart quicker than we know the heart. Yes, that's true. He does. But you see, God makes that determination on the heart and trusts that the right actions are going to follow the right heart. We struggle with forgiveness oftentimes because we say, I've done so many bad things. I've done bad things for so long. I've done more evil than good for a long period of time, and so surely I can't be forgiven. And all God's looking for is a pure heart. You see, we don't see things the way God sees things, right? We say, I'm such a terrible person, and God's looking at your heart, and when the heart changes, He sees you differently. And He tags you as different. Because it's the heart that He's looking for. You know, back when He was choosing a king, He'd given in. God had given in to their desires and gave them Saul as a king. Solomon later, sorry. He'd given them Saul as a king. But then Saul hadn't worked out too well. He was the kind of king they wanted, and when He gave them a second king, God decided to give them the kind of king that they needed. And so he chooses David. And even Samuel, as he was doing the choosing, thought this is a strange thing. You can tell Samuel, and then he obviously is being told a word by the Lord, if you will. And in the end result is, when they didn't even bring David down to be considered because they didn't assume he would be considered, and he's the one who is to be the king, Samuel says that God looks on the heart, and the heart is what makes the difference to God. Oftentimes I just simply need to reprioritize my heart. We all do. Get our heart back in the right line. Get our heart back in the right focus. In our day and time, we've learned so many things about the heart. What makes the heart get out of rhythm? We can do some very minimally invasive things to get the heart back into rhythm. We can put in a pacemaker to help it keep rhythm. We can give it a little shock at just the right time and get it back into rhythm. We can do so many things. And our spiritual heart is the same way. It can get out of rhythm. Not a bad heart, it just got out of rhythm. Not a bad heart, it's just got a little too many struggles right now. And sometimes we need to get our heart back right with God. Because when our heart is right with God, everything else follows. Because it's the heart that God's been looking at and looking for all along. It's always been the heart. If we've done anything in the church in the last few years that has been detrimental to our cause, it's that we have given in to the ways of the Pharisees and oftentimes get to thinking that it's what we do, it's the actions that we take are the most important thing. And it's never been. It's always been the heart. As we offer this song of encouragement, as we offer this invitation, if there are things that you need to lay before God to get your heart prioritized again, to get it right with God, to get it headed in the right direction again, let us know your need. We bid you to come as we stand and as we sing.